That morning was gray, the kind of sky that makes even a city like Manhattan hesitate. At the top floor of a sleek glass building, in an apartment where everything was calibrated to perfection, lights, temperature, the rhythm of coffee and silence, Ethan Walker began his day like any other. He sat at his mahogany desk, espresso in hand, eyes scanning a report from a Swiss AI startup he was negotiating to acquire. At 35, Ethan was a venture capital CEO who lived in a world where emotions were liabilities and unpredictability was the enemy. His penthouse was a fortress of control, every detail measured and planned. There was no sound, no surprises. The morning routine was sacred financial reports at 7 a.m., conference calls at 8, market analysis by 9. Life moved in predictable patterns, just the way he preferred it. Until the doorbell rang. He looked up, frowning. No one got to this floor. Without clearance, no deliveries, no guests, no appointments, showing any interruption on his meticulously organized schedule. He stood slowly, crossing the cold marble floors with the measured steps of a man who controlled every variable in his existence. When he opened the door with the guarded instinct of someone who trusted nothing to chance, everything inside him halted. She was there, Grace Harper. Her once-long auburn hair was now cut short in a practical bob. Her face thinner but stronger, her posture straighter than he remembered. But those iced-hose calm, steady eyes that once pulled him in like gravity thee were exactly the same. It wasn't Grace who froze him completely. It was the child in her arms. A little boy, maybe 4 years old, with brown hair and fair skin. The child had that intense, focused stare that belonged to someone far older than his years. And those eye-steel gray, unmistakably Thun, saw himself staring back. Grace didn't look away. No tears, no drama, no theatrical entrance, just the quiet composure of someone who had learned to survive alone for far too long. "Hi, Ethan," she said simply, her voice steady, despite the weight of the moment. "This is Leo. He's your son." The apartment lights continued their scheduled glow. The coffee remained warm on his desk. The financial reports still waited for his attention. But inside Ethan, every line of logic he had built his life upon came undone. He couldn't move. He just stared at the boy who stared back with curious, intelligent eyes, trying to figure out who this stranger at the door might be. "My son, Ethan," stammered, the words foreign on his tongue. Grace nodded, offering no unnecessary explanation, no begging, no demands. "I didn't come here for anything," she said softly, shifting Leo slightly in her arms. "I just think he deserves to know where he came from." Ethan looked again at Leo, who stood quietly now beside his mother, gripping a small plastic dinosaur in his tiny fist. The boy's gaze was unfamiliar, yet eerily recognizably as if he already understood what it meant to grow up without a father. In that moment, for the first time in years, Ethan Walker had absolutely no idea what to say. His perfectly controlled world had just shattered with 3 simple words: "He's your son." He averted his eyes from Grace's steady gaze, and in a voice lower and more uncertain than usual asked, "Would you like to come in?" And just like that, the silence that had ruled his life for years was broken. Not by sound, but by the presence of 2 people he had once left behind. Woman he had tried to forget, and the child he never knew existed 4 years ago. Ethan Walker had stood under the crystal chandeliers of one of New York's most exclusive charity galas. Marble columns stretched toward vaulted ceilings. Champagne flutes clinked in rhythm with conversations wrapped in numbers, valuations, and acquisition strategies. He was the center of it, man everyone wanted to meet too, impressed to be seen with. Investors circled him like sharks sensing opportunity. Journalists hung on his every word. Women whose eyes always saw power before humanity smiled and laughed at his polite but distant responses. But Grace Harper wasn't a guest that night. She wore a black server's uniform, her auburn hair pulled into a rushed bun after a 12-hour shift that had started before dawn. She floated between tables with practiced efficiency, carrying trays of canapes and wine, working back-to-back shifts to pay rent and help support her ailing grandmother, who lived in a nursing home in Queens. Grace hated places like this glittering. On the outside, hollow at the core, filled with people who measured worth in stock options and property values. But money was money. Her grandmother's medical bills didn't care about her principles. From her perspective, men like Ethan weren't really people. They were glass walls, inamusement talkable, distant, completely irrelevant to her real world. Of double shifts and mounting debt. Until it happened, a drunken guest, some hedge fund manager with liquor on his breath and entitlement in his grip, grabbed her wrist as she passed his table. His fingers dug into her skin as he pulled her close, whispering disgusting propositions in her ear, his other hand wandering where it had no right to be. Grace tried to pull away, her training kicking in smell. De-escalate, don't make a scene. But he wouldn't let go. His grip tightened. His words became more explicit, more demanding. Then a low voice cut through the ambient noise of the gala like a blade. Let her go. Now. Ethan didn't need to raise his voice or make a scene. He simply stood there, tall, calm, commanding with the kind of quiet authority that made powerful men step back without question. The drunk released Grace immediately. Mumbling apologies and retreating to the bar, Grace froze, still feeling the phantom grip on her wrist. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected the host of the entire event to be the one who stepped in when dozens of other guests had simply looked away. She managed a nod, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you. What's your name?" he asked, and something in his tone made her look up. "Grace," she replied, still stunned by the intervention. He said nothing more. Just looked at her net like a server in a uniform, but like someone he couldn't quite figure out. There was something in her quiet strength, her composure, even in distress, that cracked something in him he'd thought was permanently sealed. When the gala ended hours later, the marble hall had emptied of its glittering crowd. Grace was methodically clearing the last of the wine glasses, her movements efficient, despite her exhaustion, when Ethan appeared again. Gone were the admirers and the spotlight. He stood alone in the vast space, looking strangely lost without. His usual audience, his perfectly tailored tuxedo, couldn't hide the weariness in his shoulders or the something haunted in his steel-gray eyes. "Let me take you home," he offered, his voice low and rougher than it had been during his earlier conversations with investors and socialites. Grace hesitated, her hands stilling on the tray she was loading. She should have said nosh, always said no to men like him. Men with too much money and too little substance. Men who saw service staff as invisible until they needed something. But something in his eyes stopped her cold. They didn't look at her the way other wealthy men did. They didn't see a uniform or a body to be used. They saw something raw and familiar, something that recognized the exhaustion she carried like a second skin. And for one, tired. Vulnerable moment, Grace Harper let her guard down and nodded. The hotel room was bathed in warm golden light from the city below. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of Manhattan that most people only saw in movies. But Grace barely noticed the luxury surrounding her. There was no rush between them, no slick charm or empty promises. Ethan didn't try to impress her with his wealth or connections. Instead, he poured her a glass of water and sat across from her on the plush sofa. Listening as she spoke about her life, her grandmother's deteriorating health, the double shifts at 3 different jobs, the crushing weight of trying to survive in a city that devoured the vulnerable, he didn't offer pity or patronizing advice. He simply listened with the kind of attention that Grace hadn't experienced in years. When she talked about her grandmothers, stories of dancing in Harlem clubs in the 1950s, he smiled. When she mentioned her abandoned dreams of studying literature, his eyes didn't glaze over with boredom. Something broke open inside Grace that night, not because she needed him, but because she was so tired. Tired of carrying everything alone, of pretending she was fine when she was drowning, of building walls so high that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be truly seen. And Ethan, this complicated stranger, somehow made her feel safe enough to stop pretending. What happened between them wasn't just desire, though the chemistry was undeniable. It was 2 people bruised in different ways, recognizing something essential in each other through all the noise of their different worlds. When he touched her, it was with reverence, not possession. When she let herself be vulnerable with him, it felt like coming home to a place she'd never been. For hours, the barriers they'd both built around their hearts crumbled completely. Grace fell asleep in his arms, feeling, for the first time in years, like she wasn't facing the world entirely alone. But the next morning, she woke up to cold sheets and silence. The bed was empty. The room was still. Ethan was gone, as if he'd never existed, leaving no trace except the lingering scent of his cologne and an envelope on the nightstand. Grace's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was cash more than she made in a month, crisp hundreds arranged with the kind of precision that spoke of someone used to solving problems with money. Her heart pounded in her chest, heavy and slow. She wanted desperately to believe it was a misunderstanding, that he'd just stepped out for coffee, that he'd return with an explanation and that soft smile from the night before. But deep down, she already knew. She called the front desk with shaking fingers. "Ethan Walker," she managed to whisper into the phone. "Is he still checked in?" "Mr. Walker checked out at sunrise, missed no messages." Grace stood in that impersonal hallway, still in the clothes she'd worn to serve his friends at the gala, holding the crumpled envelope with its cruel offering. The hope that had bloomed in her chest 12 hours earlier withered completely. To Ethan. She realized with devastating clarity she hadn't been a beginning. She'd been a night, a brief entertainment, a moment of charity that he could purchase and then dismiss. Maybe to him, the money was an act of kindness. But to her, it felt like payment for services rendered, reducing the most vulnerable and beautiful night of her life to a transaction. That morning's betrayal was what hurt most, not the abandonment, but the hope. For one perfect night, she hadn't felt alone, and that cruel hope, followed by the crushing return to reality, nearly destroyed her. Grace didn't remember exactly how she left the hotel that morning. She only remembered the blinding sunlight hitting her face like a slap, her trembling legs carrying her through the marble lobby, and how the envelope in her hand felt as heavy as her shame. She walked for hours through New York streets that no longer sparkled like they had the night before, her mind looping with unanswered questions. Why did he disappear? How could she have been so naive? How could one night of feeling cherished turn so quickly into feeling discarded? What Grace didn't know was that 8 weeks later, that night would reveal its true consequences in the form of 2 pink lines on a pregnancy test. Now, 4 years later, Grace sat in Ethan's pristine living room, watching him struggle to process the reality of fatherhood. Leo explored the space with quiet curiosity, small fingers trailing along the edges of expensive furniture, his dinosaur clutched protectively in his other hand. "Why now?" Ethan finally asked, his voice hoarse. He sat on the edge of his leather sofa, maintaining careful distance from both Grace and the child who shared his eyes. Grace watched Leo discover a wall of financial awards and framed magazine covers featuring his father. "Because he started asking questions I couldn't answer anymore," she said simply. "And because you deserve to know you have a son. For years, Grace, for years you kept this from me." The accusation hung in the air between them. Grace felt the familiar fire kindle in her chest, the same strength that had carried her through pregnancy alone, through sleepless nights and endless worry, through building a life for Leo without any help. "Kept it from you," she repeated, her voice sharp with controlled anger. "I tried to tell you, Ethan, do you remember?" He frowned, clearly struggling with fragmented memories. 6 weeks after that night, Grace continued, "I found out I was pregnant. I spent 2 weeks getting the courage to contact you. I called your office 17 times. Your assistant told me you were unavailable and not taking personal calls. From unknown parties, I sent 3 letters to your company. They were returned unopened." Ethan's face paled as the memories began surfacing. He did remember the calls, the letters. His assistant had mentioned them in passing, some woman trying to reach him, probably another gold digger, or someone looking for a payout. "I even showed up at one of your company events," Grace pressed on, her composure finally cracking slightly. 7 months pregnant, wearing the only dress that still fit. "Security wouldn't let me pass the lobby when I mentioned your name. They said you'd given specific instructions not to be disturbed by solicitors or admirers." The room fell silent except for Leo's soft humming as he examined a crystal sculpture on the coffee table. Ethan stared at Grace, pieces of his own protective paranoia falling into place with devastating clarity. "I was pregnant and terrified," Grace whispered, "and you made it impossible to reach you, so I stopped trying. I figured if you wanted to know about the consequences of that night, you would have made yourself available for the conversation." Ethan's world tilted on its axis. All those calls he'd dismissed, all those letters his assistant had screened, Grace had been trying to tell him about Leo. "Leo," he said suddenly, testing the name. The little boy looked up at the sound, those familiar gray eyes meeting his father's for the first time with recognition. "Why Leo?" then asked. Grace's expression softened slightly. "It means brave. One, and he is. He's the bravest person I know." As if sensing the weight of the moment, Leo approached Ethan cautiously, still clutching his dinosaur. "Are you really my daddy?" he asked, with the direct honesty that only children possess. Ethan's throat tightened. He looked into those Aisha's own eyes, reflected in a face that was unmistakably his. Sunsan felt something crack open in his chest that he'd kept sealed for years. "Yes," he whispered, the word barely audible. "I think I am." Leo studied him for a long moment, then held up his plastic dinosaur. "This is Rex. He's a T-Rex, but he's not mean. Do you want to hold him?" The gesture was simple, innocent, trusting. Leo was offering to share his most treasured possession with a man he'd just met. Simply because Grace had told him this stranger was his father, Ethan accepted the small plastic dinosaur with hands that shook slightly. As his fingers closed around the toy that had been warmed by his son's grip, he felt the last of his emotional barriers crumble completely. "He's beautiful, Grace," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotions he'd suppressed for years. "You've done an incredible job raising him." But even as he said it, Ethan's mind was racing. Grace hadn't come here for money or recognition. She'd come here for Leo, to give their son the father he deserved. And Ethan realized with stunning clarity that he wanted to be that man, not because he owed it to Grace, but because in the span of 20 minutes, Leo had already claimed a piece of his heart he didn't know existed. The question now was whether Grace would let him try. 3 months later, Ethan's perfectly controlled apartment had been transformed. Colorful drawings covered the refrigerator door, toy dinosaurs populated the marble coffee table, and children's books created small, cheerful chaos on previously pristine shelves. Leo spent every weekend with his father, and what had begun as awkward supervised visits had evolved into genuine connection. Ethan discovered that being a parent required none of the skills that had made him successful in business and all of the qualities he'd thought were weakness thespians. Vulnerability, the ability to find joy in simple moments. Grace watched from the kitchen as Ethan and Leo built an elaborate fort out of couch cushions and blankets. Her son's laughter filled the space, a sound that had become more frequent since meeting his father. She'd been skeptical at first, protective and wary of Ethan's intentions, but watching him with Leo's gentle way he corrected mistakes, the pride in his eyes when Leo mastered something new, began to see glimpses of the man she'd fallen for that night 4 years ago. "Mom, look!" Leo called out, emerging from the blanket fort with his hair sticking up at impossible angles. "Dad taught me how to make the roof stable using physics." "Physics, huh?" "Ah." Grace smiled, catching Ethan's sheepish grin over their son's head. He asked why the blanket kept falling down. Ethan explained. One thing led to another, and now we're discussing structural engineering. It was moments like these that caught Grace off guard. Ethan wasn't trying to buy Leo's affection with expensive toys or elaborate outings. Instead, he engaged with their son's curious mind, answering endless questions with the kind of attention and respect that treated Leo like a person worth knowing. Later that evening, after Leo had fallen asleep in the fort they'd built, Grace and Ethan found themselves alone on the balcony overlooking the city. The silence between them was different. Now not the charged tension of their first reunion, but something more complex. "I owe you an apology," Ethan said quietly, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. "For that morning, for leaving." Grace studied his profile in the city lights. Why did you leave, Ethan? Really? He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw with honesty, because I was terrified, he admitted. That night with you was the most real I'd felt in years. I'd built my entire life around control, around keeping people at a distance. But with you, all of that disappeared. I felt things I'd convinced myself I was incapable of feeling. Grace felt her heart constrict. So you ran. I ran, he confirmed. I told myself I was protecting you from getting involved with someone like me. But really, I was protecting myself from feeling that vulnerable again. And the money. Ethan's jaw tightened with regret. That was supposed to be help. I knew you. We're struggling financially, and I thought, God, I was such an idiot. I thought I was being considerate by not making you ask for help. It felt like payment, Ethan. Like you were paying me to disappear. The pain in her voice cut through him. I know, and I've regretted it every day since. They stood in comfortable silence, the city sprawling below them, both lost in thoughts of paths not taken and mistakes that couldn't be undone. I don't want your money, Grace said finally. I never did. Leo and I have built a good life. My own business, now a small catering company. We're doing fine. I know you are. You're incredible, Grace. The way you've raised him, the life you've built. I'm in awe of your strength. Grace turned to face him fully. But you want to be part of it now? If you'll let me? Not because I think you need me, but because I need. I need both of you. Leo is the best part of me I never knew existed. Over the following months, they built something entirely new together. Not a recreation of that one perfect night, but a family forged through honesty, patience, and the shared love of an extraordinary little boy. Ethan learned to braid Leo's hair for school and to see business deals. Through the lens of the world, he wanted to leave his son. Grace learned to trust again, to believe that some people could change, and that love didn't always mean losing herself. 1 year after that gray morning, when Grace had knocked on his door, Ethan knelt in the same spot where she'd first introduced him to Leo, but this time he held a small velvet box instead of his son's plastic dinosaur. I know we did everything backwards, he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. But I'd like to do the rest of it right. Will you? Marry me, Grace? Will you let me love you both for the rest of my life? Leo, now 5 and far more interested in the implications than the romance, piped up from his spot on the couch. Does this mean you're going to live here all the time, Dad? Grace laughed through her tears as she looked at the two most important people in her world, man who had learned that control meant nothing without love, and the brave little boy who had brought them together. Yes, she whispered, and the word felt like coming home. 6 months later, they were married in a small ceremony in Central Park. Leo served as both ring-bearer and best man, proudly announcing to anyone who would listen that his parents were finally getting married, which means we're a real family now. As they danced under string lights hung from century-old trees, Grace marveled at how much could change in 18 months. She'd knocked on Ethan's door expecting nothing more than giving Leo the truth about his father. Instead, she'd found something she'd stopped believing in, a love that transformed everyone it touched. Ethan held his wife close as their son chased fireflies with the other children, and realized that the most successful acquisition of his career hadn't been a company at all. It had been learning to open his heart to the family he'd never known he needed. The end.